Psychology is full of myths, but how do we differentiate between reliable research and flat-out bad science? Let's talk about it. Hello there, this is Jori Huhn, an undergraduate at Oregon State University. I'll be guest hosting this episode of Psych Everywhere, a podcast by Psych High, the International Honor Society in Psychology. For this show, distinguished guests weigh in on applying psychological science to a diverse range of current events and to better your life. Listen for free wherever you go for podcasts, or see the link in the show notes for a written transcript for this episode. This episode was made possible by CSPP Alliant International University. If you'd like to learn more about graduate programs at CSPP, be sure to check out the link in the show notes for this episode. On today's episode, I'm going to be picking Dr. Douglas Bernstein's brain about various psychology myths. I'm interested in how both students and non-students engage with common psychology myths. As a researcher, I am also curious about the role that education plays in conscious consumerism. In this episode, I'm going to be referencing Dr. Bernstein's Association for Psychological Sciences resource on dispelling 10 popular myths in psychology. So I'm here with Dr. Bernstein. Dr. Bernstein, could you tell us just a little bit about your bio, what you're doing currently, and your topic of interest in psychology?
Okay. Well, if you want to go back to my university days, I was a psychology major at the University of Pittsburgh back in, you won't believe it, but 1961. I had a chance to work in a laboratory there with one of the professors. It wasn't working with humans. I was running rats in a maze, but it gave me a chance to understand how research was done, and it got me in touch with a number of the psychology professors at the University of Pittsburgh Psychology Department. And as a result of that, I was encouraged to go on to graduate school. I wasn't really sure what I was going to do with a graduate degree, but it seemed like a good idea at the time. So I was accepted at Northwestern University, and I did my graduate work there from 1964 to 1968. And then I got a job, my first job, and really my only job, at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And I went there in the fall of 1968, and I stayed there until the fall of 1998.
Wow.
It was 30 years, although I did have 2 years off for sabbatical, and those sabbaticals were at what was originally Western Washington State College in Bellingham, now Western Washington University. My training was in clinical psychology, and my research interests initially included things like health psychology, particularly modification of smoking behavior. That was what I did my dissertation on. And then I got interested in research on assessment of anxiety. I came to Illinois when behavior therapy was kind of just getting started. Everybody was doing systematic desensitization for phobia, and the University of Illinois Psych Department was sort of a real hotbed for research in behavior therapy. And I was interested in the treatment, of course, but I was also interested in how you measure anxiety. Most of the research being done those days was analog research, meaning that you would get undergraduate students who you knew had phobias of rats or snakes or whatever it might be, the dark, heights, and you would have them participate in behavioral assessment tests. So, for example, you would have them come into a room where there was a rat in a cage, a laboratory rat, not a sewer rat. And you really had to stick with the clean rats, and you would ask the student to open the cage and pick up the rat. Well, as you might imagine, if you knew already that they were afraid of rats, they weren't very likely to do that. But I had attended a colloquium that was, and then the speaker was a psychiatrist named Martin Orne, O-R-N-E. And he was the sort of the guy that named the idea of demand characteristics. He made the point that, when people go into a laboratory as a research subject, they enter what he called a pact of ignorance. That is, the researcher is telling the participant a story. I'm going to do this, you're going to do that. And even if it doesn't make sense to the participant, he or she just goes along with it. It's like, I'm not going to tell you that I think you're lying to me. So everybody just kind of agrees to not say anything. And Orrin did this fabulous research with hypnosis and other things that showed that by manipulating the social pressure in the situation, he could get people to do all kinds of things. And this impressed me a lot. And I began to think about it when it came to these behavioral avoidance tests. I thought, here's a student who says, I'm afraid of rats. And now I'm being asked to go into a room and pick up a rat. Well, they don't expect me to pick up the rat, and I don't want to pick up the rat, so I'm not going to. But what if we changed the demand characteristics in the situation? What if we said, we know that you're afraid of rats. We'd like to know something about your physiological reactions when you're in contact with a rat. And so then I did some research where we attached recording devices to the participant and said, we just want you to go in and get as close to the rat as you can and pick it up if you will, so that we can measure your responses. And we got participants behaving almost fearlessly if they thought we were recording them because they wanted to help us get those measurements. We did the same thing with claustrophobia. We knew that these were people who feared being in closed, dark places, and we had them participate. We asked them to get into this chamber, and we gave different instructions, and we were able to manipulate their behavior in these assessments. That the differences in their behavior under low and high demand were so large that it looked like the size of the differences you would see before and after therapy. So this was some of my earlier work back in the late 60s and into the 70s. And then I got interested in other kinds of fear, particularly fear of dentistry. I got involved in research evaluating methods for dealing with that and helping people get dental care when they had been afraid of it for a long time. And then in the mid-'80s, I got involved in teaching introductory psychology. And I ran the intro psych course at Illinois, where we had about 5,000 students a year. And I started training graduate students to teach small sections of the course. And that generated my interest in promoting good teaching. And that's sort of been the focus of my work for a long, long time. And then recently, long after I retired, I retired in 1998. More recently, about 10 years ago, I got interested in the misconceptions that people in general and students in particular have about psychology. As a result of a seminar that I organized in Paris back in 2018, I started working with a group of people on collecting data on the prevalence of various misconceptions among students in psychology and in other fields. And that's sort of evolved, and now we're starting to talk about how we can debunk misconceptions so that they stay debunked, because it's very difficult to do. So that's been the trend in my research career. And along the way, I've written some books on introductory psychology and clinical psych and abnormal and a few other things. So it's been a very busy academic life, and I'm at a point in my days where many people my age are now out playing golf and going to the early bird special in the restaurants here in Florida, and I'm still working on books and collecting data.
That's a wonderful scope of research and different things that you've tapped into over your career.
Yeah, it's been a very interesting life, and I learned that very early that academics is probably the best career a person could have. I used to say that it's the easiest job you can get without a mask and a gun, because really you get so much. I know it's not easy being in academics. It's not a simple, easy job, but in some ways it provides you with a lot more freedom than most other kinds of work. You're able to pursue your interests in a way that you might not be able to do if you were working in the private sector for, say, a research organization, or if you were working for Microsoft or Apple or something like that. And you get to be with young people all the time, which is wonderful because it keeps you from getting old. And you stay in touch with what's going on in the world. I'm looking forward to a few more years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, today I want to touch on that last point that you talked about, sort of getting into the common myths or misconceptions that a lot of students get into. So my first question for you, one of the biggest psychological myths is the idea that we only use 10% of our brains. In your opinion, is this myth more immobilizing or motivating for humans? And could you talk about what the reality of this myth is?
Well, I can start with the reality of it. It's certainly a misconception. If we were only using 10% of our brains, we would probably be dead, unless the only 10% we were using was in the brainstem, because you pretty much need your whole brain if you're going to be functioning. If large sections of your brain were shut down, you would really be in a lot of trouble. I mean, our entire brain is active all the time to greater or lesser extent, even when we're asleep. So there's no sense to the notion that only 10% of your brain is working. Now, I think the misconception is that we only are using 10% of our brain power, that we might not be using our mental capacity to its fullest extent. Even that is kind of inaccurate, because you have capacity. It's a question of whether you use it. Now, you can buy nutritional supplements that are supposed to enhance your brain power. You can participate in programs, brain training programs that are supposed to allow your brain to work at a higher capacity. There's no empirical evidence that those things make any difference on their own. But we all know about placebo effects. And if you've just spent, $150 on a brain training program, and then somebody says, "So has it helped you?" You're going to say, "Oh yeah, it did." Otherwise, you're going to say, "I threw my money away," and that doesn't feel very good. I'm always amused by the commercials for Prevagen and other nutritional supplements that you see on television, because the people that are using them are always interviewed, and they tell you how, it really made a big change in me, and I swear by it. I've been taking it for a long time, and I really feel much sharper, and so on. And it's a good opportunity, if you're teaching a course in psychology, to bring this misconception up, because you can talk about the evidence in favor of this 10% idea, and the evidence for methods of trying to improve your brain's functioning. Because as I say, they're mostly testimonials from people who have paid for a product and then they find it to be useful. So I like to use misconceptions to teach about research methods. And this particular misconception is one that is ideal. If somebody believes that, we really only use 10% of our brain power, and they think, well, good, then I don't have to try. I'll just kind of stay where I am, and that's about the best I'm going to be able to do. That person's probably not going to bother doing anything to try to improve their academic performance, their mental performance. Other people are going to say, wow, if I'm only using 10% of my brain power, think of the potential that I've got. It's funny, I'm just revising my intro psych textbook right now, and I have a little feature in the first chapter about that particular misconception. And I point out that if you are interested in improving your mental capacity and your academic performance, rather than take a nutritional supplement or a brain training course. The best way to do it is probably to build up your study skills, study harder than you normally do, and eat right, get plenty of sleep and exercise, because all of those things are going to help you do better. You're not going to supercharge your brain. You're not going to become supernatural, but you will come closer to your full potential. And one other thing about the notion of whether it's immobilizing or motivating, people differ in how interested they are in various topics. And honestly, there are some topics that are just, if you're not majoring in that field, it's going to be rough to do well in a course. I'm sure everybody listening to this podcast has had the experience of being in a class that you could barely force yourself to stay awake in. And, no matter how much you might want to improve your performance in that class, it's probably just not going to happen. So motivation and interest play a big part in this as well. I don't think it's a life-threatening misconception, but I do think the danger is that people who believe in it may be more prone to buy useless products to try to help themselves.
As a college student, I am curious what your thoughts are on young people and their consumption of information. So specifically, in your opinion, are young people more susceptible to believe myths about the brain than other generations?
Well, I don't have any data. So if you ask me about my opinion, misconceptions about the brain are very prevalent, and they always have been. There's quite a bit of research on what's called neuromyths. And these are measured in introductory psychology courses. There's studies measuring them in courses in abnormal and in biological psychology. And they do seem to be quite prevalent. Things like the left brain, right brain differences, where people believe that you're either right-brained or left-brained. And that, again, makes no sense. If you were left-brained only and your right brain isn't working, you're going to really have a problem with movement on the left side of your body. So, it doesn't make much sense. However, I should just point out that we are lateralized to some extent, but there's some tasks that are handled more by the right hemisphere than by the left. It's just that they communicate with each other all the time, so they coordinate their activity.
This episode was made possible through a PsychHigh sponsorship with the Alliant International University California School of Professional Psychology. That's CSPP. Founded in 1969, CSPP was one of the nation's first independent schools of professional psychology. Today, CSPP continues its commitment to preparing the next generation of mental health professionals and advocates. Their dedication to ensuring every community's access to quality mental health care extends from integrated care to inclusive family therapy. Explore their programs using the link in the show notes.
People today, young people and old people, have access to far more information far faster than they ever did before. When I was a teenager in the 50s, if you wanted to learn about something, you went to the library. Maybe you'd read the newspaper. Believe it or not, this was it was in the very early days of television. And so the resources available to you to get information were just very, very limited. And it took more effort. Now, today, it takes no effort, virtually no effort. You don't even have to type. You can just talk to Siri or whatever other AI system you want to interact with and get information. And in a way, the problem is still the same, because whether you're going to the library or you're on ChatGPT, you're getting information, but you don't know necessarily how to evaluate it. And so I think that, again, it makes a difference who you are. Some people are simply more gullible. They're more willing to accept what they're told. If they see it on the internet, it must be true, kind of thing. And others are more skeptical. And so I would guess that many of the misconceptions that people hold today are very similar to the ones that they held 50 or 60 years ago. It's just that they may believe them for different reasons. They may believe them because they're getting it from what they consider to be an authoritative source. And once they have them, it's very difficult for them to give them up. And sometimes, it doesn't matter if they give them up or not. As I said before, the 10% myth is not something that's going to be life-threatening to you. Another one that students have believed forever is that it's on a multiple choice test. If you're not sure of your answer, you should stick with your first impulse and not go back and change it. I heard this when I was in high school, and you still hear it today. There's very clear evidence that that's incorrect. That's a misconception. You're more likely to get the answer correct if you think about it a little more and you realize, oh, I made a mistake. I'll go back and fix it. And so I don't think that the acceptance of misconceptions has changed that much. I just think that they come at us through multiple sources now that are just so easy to be exposed to. That they tend to persist. And it takes some skepticism and careful thinking to decide whether you're going to act on these misconceptions.
My next question for you. You have written about brain training and briefly touched on it earlier in our conversation. I'm curious, what is brain training? And if it is not effective, what are some strategies that are effective in promoting cognition?
Well, yeah, there's not a lot of good evidence in favor of these brain training programs, other than through placebo effects, which can be valuable. These days, placebo effects used to be considered, something bad. Now it's being harnessed in a lot of areas to actually try to change people's behavior, improve their health, reduce stress, even though the researcher and the participant knows that it's a placebo. I'm not real familiar with this work, but I've seen some studies that actually tell the participant that this is a placebo, and it still has an effect. Brain training is something that may act more as a motivator than anything else. It's a matter of learning about how the processes of learning and memory take place. The best way to improve your academic performance, aside from sleep and exercise and good diet, is to learn the best study skills. Look at research on how we learn and remember. And if you follow those principles, you're going to improve your performance. So, for example, reading and rereading a textbook is a pretty lousy way to develop a long-term memory of the content. If you were to just read a chapter for your whatever course you're taking right now, and then right before the exam, read it again, and maybe read it again, you may get the feeling that you know this material because it's looking familiar as you read it, but you may very well not remember it when you need it. On the other hand, if you engage in what the cognitive psychologists call deeper processing, you're going to remember it longer. And what I mean by that is, instead of just reading it, use that chapter to create a lecture on the topic. Then give that lecture to somebody that maybe a fellow student or a family member or even your dog, so that you are more actively involved in and engaged with the material. You'll remember it better when you've written about it yourself. Things like that make a huge difference. Taking practice tests, asking yourself questions about the content, or asking a study partner questions and having the study partner ask you questions so that you practice retrieving the information repeatedly, you're going to find that you'll remember things much longer. So I guess part of the answer is take seriously what you learn in courses in cognitive psychology, particularly learning and memory, and don't just study the way you might always have studied. A lot of people come out of high school thinking that they're A students because they've always gotten A's. And then they come to the university and they find out, hey, I'm playing in a different league. I may need to kick it up a notch to do as well here as I used to do back in high school. And so if you stick with the study skills you developed in high school, you may find that they don't work as well when it comes to college and certainly to graduate school. So I think it's a matter of recognizing you may not be as good at studying as you think you are. And so you have to be self-aware and recognize where your shortcomings are. And if you're going to take, instead of brain training, I would take a course in study skills. A lot of colleges and universities have centers that will offer students study skill workshops. There's a fellow named Stephen Chew, Chew, who offers a series of videos on study skills, which you can find on the internet. And I highly recommend those. It's all better than brain training programs and much cheaper.
My next question for you. You wrote an article about how people often mistakenly believe they are in touch with reality. Could you talk a little bit about how reality can vary from person to person?
Yeah, it's a sort of a blending of philosophy and psychology, but the only way we are in touch with the outside world is through our senses. We can see, hear, we can touch, we can smell. And we don't just take in information like a tape recorder or a video recorder. We process information all the time. So everybody looks at the world in the same way and in different ways. We all look at the same visual world, but we bring to it all of our differing expectancies and our cultural backgrounds, and even the experiences we had earlier in the day that can change the way we perceive things. So, a teacher might say something in a classroom and think it's a joke, and some students will laugh and others will be offended. And yet they all heard the same thing. So each person is, in a very real way, creating their own personal reality. Now, that doesn't mean that if I show you a red balloon, you're going to see a green balloon.
Right. But
there are subtle differences. If you look at any chapter on sensation and perception, especially perception, in an introductory psychology textbook, you'll see that there are figures such as, you've probably seen the reversible figures where you can look at it as a vase or two faces looking at each other, and you can switch them back and forth. This is an example of how perception is active. We're not just passively experiencing something and that it's the same for everyone. So in a way, if you want to understand somebody, you have to recognize that their perception of the world, their perception of reality is not necessarily the same as yours. And this underlies virtually all individual differences. When two people look at the way things go in the United States right now, some of them think it's going fine and others think it's a disaster. Right. Because their perceptions of reality differ. Mm-hmm. And if you want to get along with people and if you want to interact with people and you want to understand people, you have to keep this in mind. You can't go around assuming that everyone perceives the world the same way you do.
Absolutely. Of all the psychology myths, which do you believe is the most important for students to be aware of?
Well, actually, my research team and I, we got 15 misconceptions that we think are dangerous. And they're endorsed by at least 40% of the respondents in our research. One of them is the idea that students learn best when they're taught in accordance with their own learning style. In our research, about 87% of participants endorse that as being true. And it absolutely is not true, but it feels like it's true. That's the problem. Yeah. What we have are very strong learning preferences. And there's no doubt that people have preferences for how they learn, but it doesn't mean that they're unable to learn in other ways. So if you say, oh, I'm a visual learner, you can also learn by hearing things and you can learn by reading things. The most important aspect of this misconception is that it may prevent people from developing multiple ways of learning. If you say, oh, I can only learn visually, it's going to impair your performance, and the world is not going to adjust to you. When you get a job in some field and you are expected to learn new material, you can't say to your boss, well, I'm sorry, I can't learn in any way except by having someone speak to me. I can't learn any other way. You're gonna have problems. So the most important thing is to recognize, yeah, I have preferences in how I learn, but I need to develop skill at learning through all kinds of media. Another one that is really quite important is the misconception that if someone is thinking about suicide, that they will never talk about it in advance. And so people who believe in this misconception might kind of not take seriously a statement by a roommate or a friend or someone in their family who's talking about, maybe I don't think life is worth living. The world would be better off without me. If they don't take that seriously because they think a suicidal person will never give any indication of their desire to kill themselves in advance, then they may have missed an opportunity to get that person some help. So I think that one is a really important one. Another has to do with psychotherapy. It's widely believed that in order for psychotherapy to be effective, the method has to go back to childhood and identify conflicts that existed in childhood that are manifested in adulthood. And while that's indicative of one approach to psychotherapy, it is not a requirement. And in fact, if you look at the outcome research in psychotherapy, the behavioral and cognitive behavioral approaches and some of the new third wave versions of those generally come out superior to the traditional psychodynamic approaches. Not to say that psychodynamic approaches are not useful in some cases, but overall, the behavioral and cognitive behavioral approaches seem to be better in general. Mm-hmm. And so someone who has the misconception that a therapist who doesn't go back to their childhood isn't going to be able to help them may deprive themselves of an opportunity to improve, to solve some of the problems that they're dealing with. Another one is the notion of the misconceptions about getting help in an emergency. You're probably familiar with the notion of diffusion of responsibility. Mm-hmm. The idea that if you have a crisis, a health crisis, you're injured, or something happens to you and you're in a big crowd, you should be more likely to get help because there's more people around. But diffusion of responsibility creates this situation where often nobody steps in because they assume somebody else is going to do it. Right. And people who maintain that misconception may, in fact, contribute to the injury or death of somebody who was in danger or in need of help. And so what you want to do as a teacher, of course, is to help students understand that if you're ever in a situation like that, if you're harmed, you're hurt, you need help, there's a lot of people around, don't depend on them to come to your aid. They may not. And I always, when I was teaching the intro course, I would always remind students that if you ever need help in a crowd, don't wait for somebody to help. Say, you in the blue shirt, call 911. Mm-hmm. Because now you're putting the responsibility on that person rather than letting it be diffused among the crowd. Yeah. The misconception that psychological profilers are able to identify the perpetrators of a crime or profile a serial killer. Television shows and other media sources may give you the impression that profilers have this innate ability to identify the characteristics of somebody who's committing a crime or a series of crimes. The data are not very supportive of that. And again, this is not one that is life-threatening, but it may play a role in a trial. Let me go past profiling and just talk about eyewitness testimony, because this is another case in which a misconception that an eyewitness is the best source of information, the most reliable evidence in a criminal trial, can be a real problem because jurors may be impressed by it. They may give it a lot of weight. but the eyewitness can be wrong. And the eyewitness literature is really important to know about. Someone who is serving on a jury and holds the misconception that eyewitnesses are always reliable may actually contribute to a miscarriage of justice and find someone guilty when they weren't. And another one that's kind of changed over the years, electroconvulsive shock therapy, which is something that in the 50s and 60s was considered a sort of brutal way of dealing with problems like depression, actually has turned out to be fairly useful and safe in the cases of patients whose depression does not respond well to medication. And it's done in such a different way now that it can, in fact, be helpful in those cases. So if the family of a patient with very severe depression, especially if that person is at risk for suicide, if that family says, no, we absolutely rule out electroconvulsive therapy because it's too dangerous, they may be depriving that patient of treatment that might, in fact, help them. I think those are the main ones.
Yeah, I've definitely encountered those ones in my life and in my, we've talked about those in my intro psychology class, and I think those are really important for everyone to be aware of.
Yeah, for sure.
My next question for you is, what do you think is the biggest perpetrator of psychology-related myths?
Well, the culture that we live in. People just throw these things out and you just hear it. And as I said earlier, it's easier to get this misinformation these days because information is surrounding us at all times. I don't think that there are evil agents out there trying to create misconceptions in people.
Yeah.
It's just what you could consider common knowledge. People just assume they've heard something so many times, they just assume it must be true. And it's reinforced. I'll give you a simple example. The word schizophrenia is misunderstood by almost everybody who hasn't taken and paid attention to a psychology course. People think that schizophrenia is a split personality, which is not, that's not the definition of the disorder. And yet you hear this all the time. They'll say, oh, he was very schizophrenic. He had two different ideas about this and he couldn't decide. Using the word schizophrenic to refer to somebody who is entertaining two different opinions or trying to decide is just plain wrong. And yet you hear it so often that some people don't question it. And by the way, the interesting question is, what happens when you hear somebody endorsing a misconception? They refer to a schizophrenic patient as having split personality, or they say, oh, I have a particular learning style. And you, as the all-knowing psychology major, have the opportunity to set them straight. So what do? You may say, allow me to give you my mini lecture on this topic. And when you finish, you notice that everyone has left the room because you've just made yourself obnoxious. So you have to be kind of careful about whether, nobody likes a smartass. And so you have to not, if you want to help disabuse people of misconceptions, you have to be gentle about it. You can't be kind of arrogant and snooty and make them feel inferior because they didn't know this. My late colleague, Scott Lilienfeld, used to talk about this, and he said, the best way to do it, in my opinion, is to let the person know that you used to think that too, that I always thought that was true. And then I met this guy who told me this, or I read that and I learned that this. And now it's like you and I are having this conversation about how I learned that this is not true without telling the other person, you're ignorant. So I think all psychology majors have a duty to go out into the world and help debunk misconceptions, but they have to do it carefully.
Yeah, absolutely. My very last question for you is, with smartphones being mainstream and social media becoming a huge part of people's lives, do you think that having all this information at one's fingertips ultimately increases or decreases the prevalence of people's beliefs in psychology-related myths?
Well, it doesn't help, that's for sure.
Right.
All it does is create this avalanche of information and it adds to the workload that we have to shoulder to try to sort the wheat from the chaff and try to figure out what's true and what isn't. And I am glad that I'm as old as I am because I learned early to kind of sort through this stuff when there wasn't as much of it falling all over me. I think young people today almost need to be trained to figure out how to tell the difference between sense and nonsense. And it's not made any easier by the fact that sometimes things that were supposed to be false turn out to be true. And then many things that are supposed to be true turn out to be false. First, again, I come back to the notion of individual differences. Some people are just cognitively lazy and they're willing to accept at face value whatever information they happen to get. And so you can have two people sitting in the library talking about what they've read on the internet or came over their social media feeds, and they're both believing in incorrect information, but they're arguing about which misinformation is worse than the other. It takes an awful lot of work nowadays to sort through all this, and students and people in general who are willing to put that effort out are going to protect themselves a lot better than those who don't. And you see it in the success of all kinds of scams. People who get a text that says that, I don't know, that they've won a lottery and all they have to do is click on a link. Somebody who is just simply willing to believe their eyes and ears without critical thinking are going to be victims of these kinds of scams. And it's amazing to me the number of dollars that are wasted every year. We're talking billions in the US and around the world by all kinds of scams. And artificial intelligence is making it even worse because not only can you not be sure of what you're seeing and hearing, people can now create completely false realities, create the voice of a person that you think you know, create the image of a person you think you are seeing. I mean, I'm looking at you on the screen, but I don't really know if you're a product of artificial intelligence or if you're alive. You could be in a completely different room, and I'm looking at some kind of bot. This can turn people into. I mean, if you think about it too long, you can get paranoid. And I think criteria for paranoia may start to change over time because there are cases in which people think that there are interesting brain syndromes where people think that some familiar person has been replaced by another being. And that's now actually possible through artificial intelligence. So what was paranoia 100 years ago may not necessarily meet the criterion for paranoia today because things are possible now that were never possible before.
Yeah. Well, you answered all of my questions. Do you have anything that you really want to put out there for people to know or any questions for me?
I would just encourage people listening to this podcast to look into the literature on misconceptions, get a handle on how common they are, and look at some of the ways that they can be debunked. We know from the research that's been done so far that it's very, very difficult to change people's views of some of these misconceptions. And it's not because they're stupid, and it's not because they're just pig-headed. Some misconceptions actually mean something to them. It may be part of their cultural heritage. It may be something they learned from a beloved relative, and they hate to give that up. And there's very interesting research that's starting to come out now that indicates that rather than trying to tell people what is and isn't accurate, probably the best way is to have them do their own research and then describe that research to others. So in other words, get them to engage in some active learning about a particular assertion, an incorrect assertion, become an expert on it, and then tell other people about it. These seem to be some of the most valuable ways, most effective ways of changing misconceptions. We're doing some research on this right now, and I don't have all the results yet, but some of the most effective methods involve this kind of active engagement.
Yeah. Dr. Bernstein, you took my questions and ran with them. I am beyond pleased with your answers, and I'm so excited to get this episode out to people. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on Psych Everywhere and meeting with me. This has been so lovely.
I'm glad it helped. And if anyone wants to get in touch with me, I'm available at douglas.bernstein@comcast.net. And I have a website, www.douglasbernstein.com.
Perfect.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining me. It was a pleasure to talk with you and meet you.
Too.
You've just listened to another episode of Psych Everywhere. This podcast was made possible by CSPP Alliant International University. Learn more about graduate programs at CSPP at the link in the show notes for this episode.